Russia's now 2-year-plus long brutal war in Ukraine has created untold levels of catastrophe in Eastern Europe. More than 600,000 Russian and 300,000 Ukrainian soldiers have either been killed or wounded to date in Ukraine. This war of choice by Vladimir Putin has not only led to the death of thousands of civilians, but also massacres against civilians by Russian soldiers, such as in Bucha in March of 2022. The refugee crisis the war has created across Eastern Europe has compelled more than 6.5 million Ukrainians to flee their country, most into neighboring Poland. Under President Biden, the U.S. has supported Ukraine in its fight against Russia by supplying the country with over $64 billion worth of military aid. As at least 10,000 North Korean troops now deploy to the battlefield, and President-elect Trump looks to begin his second term, it remains very much to be seen as a policy matter whether and how the U.S. support for Ukraine will continue. Joining me today to discuss this issue is Glenn Korn, a colleague, a friend, and a longtime veteran of the U.S. intelligence and foreign affairs communities, and a previous guest of our program. During his 34 years of service in the United States government, he served as senior executive and intelligence official in the CIA. He is an expert contributor to Cipher Brief, a nonpartisan media outlet on national security issues. He is the senior director for geopolitics and global threats at the Institute of Critical Infrastructure Technology and a professor at the Institute of World Politics. I'm David Satterfield, director of Rice University's Baker Institute for Public Policy in Houston, and this is Baker Briefing. Glenn, thank you very much for joining me today. Let's zoom out a little bit and look at the situation in Ukraine, at the battlefield as it presents today. And there's much speculation about what the Biden administration is doing in its last 50 days to move weaponry and what a Trump second administration may bring. But my question to you is a very pointed one. What can, at this date, the United States do to change what appears to be a trajectory on that battlefield in which Russia ultimately, through attrition of international support, attrition of civilian infrastructure, attrition of Ukrainian military assets, will ultimately emerge the victor?
Mr. Ambassador, first, thank you for having me back to the Baker Center. It's great to see you. It's always great to speak with you. I would say, one, we shouldn't forget that since 2014, the Ukrainians have been fighting a successful fight to defend their country against a very dangerous aggressor, which has used different stages of warfare to ratchet up their pressure and aggression against Ukraine to try and basically destroy that country. And despite the battlefield losses that the Ukrainians have had, and unfortunately they've lost territory, I think we have to commend them for what they've done given the resources they've had. Unfortunately, I think some of the assistance that we provided was probably too slow, didn't get to the Ukrainians when they really needed it. In 2022, they were successfully pushing the Russians back in a very successful counteroffensive. Having traveled to Ukraine multiple times since my retirement over the last year, really the Ukrainians have to be given credit for their resilience. I mean, these are people I would personally want to go to war with because they're tough, they're innovative, they're creative, and again, they're very resilient. And the civilian population, unfortunately, they're running out of people. This is what I see. And what can the incoming administration do? First, I welcome the recent statement by the incoming National Security Advisor, who my understanding is he told President Putin, if you escalate, we're not going to tolerate it, the new administration. Don't think that there's daylight between the outgoing administration and the incoming administration on this issue, and I think that's very good. I also am very hopeful with the naming of General Kellogg, who will be the lead on the Ukraine issue. I think he has an amazing background, and he probably understands. My understanding, his position is we want peace, but we want it through strength. What can we do? One, we can continue to provide the Ukrainians with the assistance that we need, and maybe faster than we've been providing it. Two, we need to make President Putin understand that every time he ratchets up, which he's trying to do now, by the way, since the election, we can see the number of attacks, strikes they're doing, and some of the weapon systems that they're bringing to the battlefield. And when I say battlefield, we're talking about hospitals, we're talking about schools, we're talking about the electric energy grid of Ukraine. And so for the listeners, as we go into winter here in the States, can you imagine last time we were in Kiev, there's blackouts, Children are unable to go to bed with heated apartments because the Russians are going after the energy grid to try and terrorize the Ukrainian people into submission. So far, the Ukrainians have not surrendered, and I don't think they are going to surrender. But what we can do is we can make it clear to Putin that he will pay a price, and it will be more painful for him to continue this war, and that he needs to come to the negotiations table. I think any approach, and my understanding is the incoming president wants to broker a peace, and I think everybody wants to see an end to the fighting. But we have to make sure that we're in lockstep with Kiev and making sure the Russians don't give the Ukrainians the impression that we are going to sell them out without them having a say in the future of their country. President Zelensky commented that he's ready to talk about territory for a ceasefire and guarantees for the security of Ukraine in the future, because he knows very well that as long as Putin's in power, he'll probably try and start a new offensive like he did in Chechnya in the 90s when he came to power. After the first Chechen war, there was the second Chechen war. The Ukrainians understand very clearly that there's going to always be a danger from the Russians. So they need some security guarantees. And we need to have a very robust dialogue with the Ukrainians and our European partners on what those guarantees are going to look like. But Putin has got to understand that we are willing to continue this fight with him and to stand by our ally that is protecting its sovereignty, and we are not going to give up, and he shouldn't think that we are going to give up. And actually, we will cause him more pain, because sometimes I fear that here in the U.S. and the West, he has been able to convince people that he's winning and he's not having any problems. And I don't think that is the case. If you look at the Russian economy, if you look at the domestic situation he's facing with the rise of violent crimes inside his country, and of course, internationally, the loss of prestige. We can talk about what's happening in Syria right now, where the Russians seem like they have lost their ability to project power because he's fighting a war that he miscalculated on, and it's costing his country dearly. And finally, I would say that we also have to do a better job of communicating to the Russian people. This is not our war against them. This is a war to help the Ukrainians protect themselves, and that if the leadership of the Russian Federation wants to have a honest and sincere dialogue with the U.S. and NATO and have better relations, there can be a lot of benefits for Russia. Maybe not for Putin, but Putin doesn't have to be in power eternally.
Glenn, when the war began, I was part of the administration, as were you. And I've since had Bill Burns, my dear friend and CIA director, here at the Institute to talk about the considerations of escalation. Jim Baker, Secretary Baker, said the most important responsibility of any U.S. president, first and foremost, is to avoid a nuclear war with Russia. Were we overly concerned about Putin's red lines when we did not provide weapon systems in those initial 6 months that we have subsequently provided and allowed to be used to target Russian military bases? Did we make a misjudgment? If so, is that an intelligence failure? Is it a matter of overcaution? And what's the situation today? Are there still escalatory red lines for Vladimir Putin or not?
My personal opinion is that we have not done a good job of explaining and showing Vladimir Putin that we also have red lines. No one's talking about what U.S. red lines are. When you're killing civilians, when you're bombing hospitals, when you're destroying the civilian infrastructure of a country to try and expand your influence or subdue that country, that should be a red line for the United States. So easy for me to sit here in this chair and say, I would have done more. But when you're the president of the United States, you have a huge responsibility on your shoulders. And I don't envy the president for the decisions he had to make. But I do believe that we probably saw indications where we were overly cautious, even when Putin drew a red line and we crossed the red line and he did nothing. And I think then we should have been more aggressive in supporting the Ukrainians. But again, I think that this incoming administration has an opportunity to make it clear to Vladimir Putin, we have red lines, and not let you cross those red lines. If you do, they're going to pay a serious price.
And what's that price, Glenn?
Well, for one, I think that we can increase the level of aid we're giving the Ukrainians to allow them to effectively protect their country and to push back the Russians and to inflict more pain on the Russians. We have to do things like, I think some of the messaging we've put out in the last 4 years has been not only ineffective, but very confusing for our Ukrainian partners, like asking them not to strike certain targets in Russia, putting red lines on them, or what they could use the weapon systems that we gave them, which the Russians were able to take advantage of by redislocating forces to put them out of the range of the systems which are very effective systems, by the way. This administration should probably make it clear to Putin, we're not going to put those restrictions on the Ukrainians. If you escalate, we are going to escalate. We are going to go toe-to-toe with you. We are more resilient than you are. And I think we can also cause more harm to the Russian economy because, this goes to energy policy. We're in the state of Texas. I think there are things that we can do to make it even more painful for Putin and his economy. And we don't want to do that. We want to have a better relationship with Russia and the Russian people. But if they're going to allow their government to continue to wage a war against their neighbor, we need to use every tool that we have to make them pay.
I'll simply note your use of the term we. This is, if it is not already the case, the introduction of a direct U.S.-Russian confrontation, which is something this administration has sought unsuccessfully, I would argue, to avoid. You assess the risks, then, of that direct U.S. hand in confronting Russia against the risks of a Putin victory. The better case for U.S. interests is the former, not the latter.
I would suggest, one, we've been at war with Russia for a while. I think this is a little bit of like denial on the part of the U.S. not to recognize that we're at war. The Russians see things that we are doing as being acts of war against Russia. Sanctions, providing weapon systems to a country that they're fighting with. They are doing things that are acts of war, including massive disinformation operations to try and undermine our country, attacking the U.S. critical infrastructure with cyber attacks. If we see what they're doing in Europe, sabotage operations, lethal operations, assassinations. These are all things that are acts of war. And last time we were in Ukraine, some of the Ukrainian security officials talked to us about how the Russians walked up the chain and before they actually sent troops in official, Russian uniforms, not the little green men. So we're in a state of war with Russia. If we want to end that war, we need to show the Russians that we have the power and the will to stand up to them. And I agree with you, Mr. Ambassador. I say this all the time. I don't want to live in a world. I don't want my sons to live in a world where Vladimir Putin gets away with what he's done and where he is allowed to basically destroy, annihilate another country and another people. Because if that happens, the consequences for the United States are going to be extremely negative on a number of levels, which I'm happy to share my assessment or opinion of on why.
Let's talk first, Glenn, about bringing this conflict to an end, which the incoming administration declares is its objective. President Trump has said on day one, is a victory, a sweeping victory, which is the elimination of an independent Ukrainian state, under whatever guise that may come. Putin's existential goal, can he settle for anything less than that, except as a temporary holding arrangement until Russia can rearm, rebuild, further attrit international support, and then move again for the final accomplishment?
So I think that Putin initially wanted to take Ukraine completely. Whether he was going to do it by force or by political action, covert influence operations, we knew what his goal was. He wanted to control Ukraine. And as I've said to people in the past, he also wanted to make it so that nobody else could have Ukraine. He would spoil Ukraine for everybody else, including the Ukrainian people, because he wants to keep it as a buffer to protect him for both ideologically, because he saw the Ukrainians were actually moving away and in a better direction than Russia was, and he knew the Russian people were seeing that and getting frustrated. Why were the Ukrainians able to elect their own president and the Russians not able to do that? Why was the Ukrainian economy beginning to deal with a lot of the systemic problems that came out of the Soviet Union? The Russian economy wasn't. Why were Ukrainians now able to travel to Europe without visas and the Russians weren't? It was because, and many Russians used to say this to me, it's because of the president and his ego, President Putin. So today, we have got to make sure that the Ukrainians have a say in whatever the settlement is going to be, and that we do provide them with real guarantees. We can't repeat the mistake we made in the past, because we did give them guarantees of their sovereignty, and we failed them. I think we have to accept that, and which is also could have serious consequences in other parts of the world. So we've got to give them credible guarantees that are going to require some tough decisions by the U.S. and our NATO partners. And I think the last thing I'll say is, the incoming administration, I had the privilege of working for that administration as well. And I have to say, people always say, President Trump was weak on Russia. I don't agree. I never saw a president who acted as swiftly and as decisively on issues when the Russians crossed his red lines or the red lines of the U.S. government. So I'm hopeful that the team he's bringing in for the new administration is going to go back to the policy. He wants peace, and I think we all agree with that, but not at the expense of American interests and credibility.
So, Glenn, now I'll turn to the issue of, and why is the outcome in Ukraine important? Let's look at some of the contextual circumstances. You have a move, not just in the United States, but in Europe, away from external engagement. It's inward turning. You have a rise of populist, nationalist governments or strong opposition movements throughout Europe, throughout the West. You have the claimed diminishment of U.S. war reserve stockpiles between the draw from Israel over the last 13 months, Ukraine over the last almost 3 years. U.S. needs to rearm itself for the true strategic challenge of our times, which is not Russia or Europe, it's China. Now, these are all buffering elements in shaping a decision on what to do about Ukraine. Your argument is to provide more of those arms in diminishingly small supply, as it has been argued, for an extended engagement to confront Russia directly in a way that may not end soon, or in a fashion that does not engage the U.S. further. Indeed, it would almost have to engage the U.S. further. Then there's the issue of NATO. At a moment when the incoming administration has raised question marks over the alliance partnerships, their value against their cost, is there going to be support for an extension of some form of NATO assurances or guarantees for Ukraine? Now, I present all of that to you as the backdrop for why, given all of this, does the outcome in Ukraine truly matter to the U.S.?
Couple of points I'd like to make. Obviously, a lot in your question, which I'd love to address, because it's very important that we address it with the American people, with your listeners. But I'll try and, go, why is this important? If we fail the Ukrainians now, and we have to understand that a lot of our current allies and potential allies are not going to be able to rely on. They're going to think we can't rely on the U.S. in the future, and we're not going to go out of our way to partner with the U.S. And I always give this example. I spent much of my career fighting counterterrorism, doing counterterrorism operations after 9/11. We needed partners to do that. We didn't do a lot of stuff on our own. I had the privilege of working with a lot of other foreign services that were very good partners and that helped us stop a lot of threats to the homeland. If we think that we're going to be able to send the message to the world that we're not reliable partners and we're going to stop our assistance for a country that's fighting for its survival, I think we have to understand we're not going to be able to count on that in the future at a time when the number of threats is actually increasing. It's even worse than it was after 9/11. The level of complexity, Director Burns talks about this, and I agree with him 1,000%. I've never seen the world so complicated and dangerous as we see today. We need to stop those threats outside of the homeland, and to do that, we need partners. So that's one. And it's not just terrorism. It's proliferation of weapons of mass destruction. It is proliferations of conventional technology, which has become extremely dangerous. By the way, we've seen on the battlefield in Ukraine, both the Ukrainians and the Russians have been amazing in the innovation and things they've done with household items to turn them into weapons of not mass destruction, but destruction. We are going to need the partnership of the Ukrainians in the future to help protect against that. And we definitely don't want the Ukrainians, who are a very good fighting force, to go over to the side of the Russians or to become some kind of neutral state which is angry at the U.S. and not willing to cooperate with the U.S. We also have to remember that Ukraine is a valuable partner because business-wise, there's a lot to be done. They have natural resources. They have a very talented, despite the fact that they're at war, they're doing things which are pretty amazing, not just in the military sense, but also technology-wise. We want the Ukrainian market to be a market that we can participate in and benefit from. I think the Ukrainians still want us there. But if we fail them, they're not going to want us there. So we have to remember that too. And part of what Putin is doing is a grab for resources. We should not want Russia to control those resources, because at the end of the day, it's going to mean that China controls those resources, which allows me to address the question of China. We have to see this as a whole. China, Iran, Russia, North Korea today are presenting us with a common front. And if we want to counter the Chinese and send a strong message to the PRC, we've got to do it through the battlefields of Ukraine. Ukrainians never come and say, send your children to fight. They are helping stop a threat, which is a direct threat to the United States. They are sacrificing their lives to do it. And this is also keeping the Chinese. I'm sure people in Beijing are watching this saying, if the Americans turn their backs on the Ukrainians, this gives us a good indication of what they're going to do in the Asia-Pacific region, and we can expand our influence there using aggressive policies, tactics like Putin has done. But if the Americans continue to stand, and if the Europeans continue to stand, with the Ukrainians, then we need to think twice on whether we're going to aggress Taiwan or any other country in the region. And now this allows me to talk about the Europeans. One, I agree with President Trump's position that the Europeans need to pay their fair share for the collective defense of NATO. I think if you look at the statistics in Ukraine, the Europeans have done quite a bit. I think the situation has changed quite a bit since his first presidency. What I saw after February of 2022, the Europeans finally got the message, not just on Russia, but on the PRC. I remember the famous meeting he had with the Germans where he said, why am I helping you when you're doing all these gas and oil deals with the country that you claim I'm defending you from, Russia? I think the Germans have learned a lesson. I think other members of the NATO alliance have learned a lesson. By the way, the alliance has expanded thanks to Vladimir Putin and his miscalculation, which is a benefit for us. We have some great new members of the alliance. President Trump is inheriting an important alliance. It's a good alliance. I think the Europeans have realized that he was right on some issues when he was saying that you need to pay your fair share. And then the last thing is, my recollection is under President Trump, we actually expanded our footprint in Europe, the U.S. military, which is a good thing. And, this incoming administration was the one to approve lethal aid to the Ukrainians. So there are good positive trend lines, which I hope that we can continue to develop. We absolutely have to have an honest dialogue with the Europeans, remembering that the Europeans do a lot for the alliance, and it's not as simple as who pays how much money into the budgets. There are other things that we get out of the alliance which are hard to, maybe quantify, but if you look, some of the cooperation we get on other issues are very, very important and very good value. But if we fail Ukraine, we can see the alliance start to split. The Russians are definitely going to try and start driving wedges between key members of the alliance. They're going to continue to try and convince the Europeans that the United States is not a reliable partner, that the United States is dictating its will to you. We don't want that to happen. Europe is a critical ally for us. It's a critical market for the U.S. And again, the Chinese are watching all of this. This is my assessment. And so far, they've seen there has been some unity, and they've seen that there are serious consequences if they try and invade Taiwan. They need to continue to understand that the consequences will be too painful for them to make such a move.
Glenn, you've been a long-time first-hand observer of Putin, of the Russian security services, of how that unique structure of governance with the oligarchs works and doesn't work. Are there indeed pressures that can be brought to bear, should we do those things you've recommended, that will get Putin to truly back away from, drop his objectives in Ukraine?
I think there are. Again, economically, the sanctions regime has been somewhat effective. It takes time, but there's more we can do to continue to hurt the Russian economy if they continue to try and hurt the Ukrainians or any of their other neighbors. Because we shouldn't forget Georgian territory is still under occupation, Moldovan territory is still under occupation, and they continue to threaten the Baltic states. We should not let them do that if we want to be a good ally to those countries. We have to remember that, and this is just my opinion, I've said this before, I want to go back to the days of Ronald Reagan, where we challenged the Soviets everywhere, not just in Ukraine. In the Middle East, in Africa, we need to step up our game. By the way, against the PRC as well. There are whole fronts of the battlefield that we're really not competing well in today. The Western Hemisphere. The Russians, the Chinese are deep in Venezuela, Nicaragua. We need to challenge them there and make Putin decide, I'm going to spend money either in Syria or in Venezuela or in Cuba, or I'm going to spend it in Ukraine. Because he doesn't have unlimited resources. That's the fallacy. He is not doing well. And the people that continue to pretend that he is surviving and he's, this is all easy for him, that is not true. The Russian people are suffering under his poor leadership.
If, in fact, the policy prescription you've just laid out is followed, what it really is a return to a not passive, but proactive containment strategy, which is global in its scope, which requires strategic patience, continuity of effort, directed at multiple fronts, not just geographically, but at China and Russia at the same time in complex and nuanced fashion, depending on the specific threat posed. Ukraine is only one very prominent, but only one of those fronts. That's going to require something which I would argue, I think you will accept, has been absent for many, many years in U.S. dialogue, political, internal dialogue, which is an explanation, a frank dialogue with the American people on why this kind of effort is important. Why it's important for Houston, Texas, when I've got potholes or a decaying bridge that I use every day, and you're sending more tens or hundreds of billions overseas? Why? That's a conversation with the American people that, frankly, has not been held very often.
Yes, I agree. One, the current administration, I think, has failed on the messaging piece. I think I said that last time I was here. People don't understand, and I do these talks about Russia, Ukraine, and people always ask very legitimate questions. And they don't seem to feel that Washington is communicating to them on why we're providing support. What I heard last time I was here is we're not against supporting the Ukrainians. We just don't know why we're doing it and what the plan is. So the incoming administration has an opportunity. After the elections, I think I'm personally hopeful now that the administration will see that they do have a great opportunity to engage the American public, to communicate with them. I don't think that this isolationist tendency we hear about, I don't know if it's isolationism or it's a rejection of some of the aspects of globalization. And we have to be realistic about that. And we need to communicate to the American people why it is in your best interest here in Texas to support our allies. One of the reasons, and we talked about this last time, and I say this all the time, I think the statistics that I have, about 80% of all the money we're giving the Ukrainians is coming back to the U.S. economy. It's creating jobs in Texas. The way that you fix the potholes in your town in Texas is there's a defense plant where people are employed, they're paying taxes, including into the municipal budget, and then the roads can be fixed. This is happening all over the country. We're rebuilding our defense industrial base. To your question about, does the U.S. have enough stockpiles? We probably do not have enough right now, but we better get there. And the way to do that is to revive the defense industrial base. Again, new administration, new opportunity. Let's take advantage of the opportunity. It's good for the U.S. economy. It's good for our allies. We're not just selling weapon systems now to the Ukrainians, but to a lot of other countries who have been scared by what Putin has done, and they prefer to have U.S. weapon systems. There are probably things we can do that better and more efficiently, which that's a whole other conversation on reform in the U.S. government, which I think has to happen to streamline and to better encourage innovation, because right now I think some of the system discourages that. That's probably a whole topic for another podcast, but we have an opportunity. Let's take advantage of the opportunity. And I know the American people, and I think the American people are good people. They know the right thing, and the right thing is to not abandon a country that's being threatened with its annihilation. And it may cost some tax money, but it actually is coming back to us in droves at the end of the day. Again, for a number of reasons which they have to understand, tactical and strategic.
And Glenn, all polling shows that Americans across the political spectrum are broadly supportive of Ukraine and opposed to a Russian victory. The issue is what it takes to get there, and I think you're quite right. Uncertainty or lack of clarity on Dave Petraeus' famous question, tell me how this ends. Is this an indefinite, years-long draw on U.S. resources, on global resources? To what end? Or is there another tactic, another strategic approach that can affect a satisfactory, positive end from the standpoint of U.S. and global interests, other than acceding to Putin's desire to win? That's the real challenge here.
Definitely a challenge, but it's a challenge that can be met. We have a new opportunity. Whether you support the outgoing or incoming administration, whether you're apolitical, it is a new opportunity, and we should take advantage of it. And I hope that we do take advantage. I agree with the American people. Again, I travel all over the country. People are supportive of the Ukrainians. They just want to know why we're supporting them and what is the plan. And we need to articulate that for them.
Glenn, thank you very much. Baker Briefing is brought to you by the Baker Institute for Public Policy, which provides meaningful, nonpartisan policy analysis on the most critical challenges facing the United States, Texas, and the world. This episode was produced by Karina Zamel. AV production was led by Kevin Young. Be sure to visit us at bakerinstitute.org to learn more. Thank you for listening.